evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams. Tonight, we're going to get into some Black history and Filipino history where they converge in 1899. Now, the way I got to this subject is, while we were reading the autobiography of Langston Hughes, The Big C, there was a section in the book where a Filipino boy quit his position aboard a ship, and Langston Hughes took his position. And then there was another position on the ship where a Filipino boy was the cook. So I decided to look into some Filipino history to see if there was any connection between Black people in America and Filipinos. And I found that after the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, the U.S. ventured to the Philippines in 1899 as an imperial force to take over the Philippines. Now, they wanted to take over the Philippines because they wanted to use the resources of the Philippines. They wanted to have a naval force in that area so they could be close to Asia and open up trade with China. Purely imperial forces. Now, where does Black history come into this? Well, the Buffalo Soldiers and Black regiments were sent to the Philippines in 1899 when the U.S. found that when they went in to take over the Philippines, because Spain supposedly ceded the Philippines over to the U.S., where actually Spain had lost control of the Philippines because they were defeated by the insurrectos, or the revolutionary forces in the Philippines. They lost to them. So when they seceded the Philippines to the U.S. had trouble with the revolutionaries in the Philippines. So in order to fight these insurrectos, as they were called later, which is the Spanish term for insurgents, they brought in Buffalo Soldiers and Black infantry who were fighting the Indians in America and some Black regiments that were fighting the Cubans in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. So when these Black soldiers arrived in the Philippines, they knew that what they were facing in the Philippines and what they were fighting for in the Philippines was white supremacy and colonialism for the U.S. And they were very much against it because the white people in the Philippines started to demonize the Filipinos to justify their killing and their genocide of the Filipinos. And the way that they began to demonize the Filipinos was in the same manner that they demonized Black people in America. They called the Filipinos niggers, monkeys, black devils, and everything that they called Black people, they called the Filipinos. And they were there to so-called civilize the uncivilized. And they wanted to they sent missionaries to do some type of beneficial civilization of these people, but it was complete genocide. And on some accounts, they killed up to 3 million Filipinos during this civilization period. Now, I have an article called "An African American Soldier in the Philippine Revolution, a homage to David Fagen," and we're going to get to David Fagen. But first, I just want to read a section of this article called "Counting the Victims." Now, this was in the New York Review of Books. Between the years of 1899 and 1913, the United States of America wrote the darkest pages of its history, the invasion of the Philippines, for no other reason than acquiring imperial possessions prompted a fierce reaction of the Filipino people. 400,000 Filipino insurrectos died under the American fire, and 1 million Filipino civilians died because of hardship, mass killings, scorched earth tactics carried out by the Americans. In total, the American war against a peaceful people who fairly ignored the existence of the Americans until their arrival wiped out 1/6 of the population of the country. Our policy in the Philippines was genocide. We were not there to liberate or even defend a liberty-loving people. We were there to acquire those rich islands, and if we had to kill the entire population, we would have done so, just as we had killed the Indians in the century before. Some of our best troops in the Philippines were former Indian fighters, and as we would kill Southeast Asians later in this century, and this was written, quoted from a book in 1981. Now, so the U.S. was there just to take over this land. Now, the article and some other articles account that when Spain left the Philippines had actually defeated the Spaniards, began to set up their own government, an own local government and a national government. And after that national government was set up and they were a sovereign nation, then the United States came in and just took over. Now, you know that the Philippines, that when a country is at war, they get weakened. So the Philippines, the Filipinos were at war with the Spaniards, and there was no way that they could just regroup and fight against the U.S., but they tried their best. And when they brought in the black soldiers, there was a brigade of black press that protested this invasion of the Philippines, because that's what it was. It was an invasion, and the black press talked about it. And I want to read a section about that, because this is why it's necessary to have black press. Because I talked about discourse and how media establishes the discourse. They, like in this instance, they demonize the people. They tell the U.S. what these people are about, what the army is there for, and then as that discourse is established, it's ratified, and then it becomes truth, and then the people believe it and people back it up. Now, it's easy for white people to understand this, and because they like to fall in line, because they're the ones over there trying to colonize. You know, they're the ones over there trying to take control. So when you call these people niggers and you call them monkeys, you call them uncivilized, they'll fall right in line with it and say, oh, we need to civilize these people. But the black people who are sent over there, they know what it feels like to be called monkeys, niggers, devils, less than human, and all of that. So they're not buying it. They don't buy it as much as white Americans do. So when they were in the Philippines, they found themselves face to face with people who are as brown as they were, in some instances browner. And you're going to be surprised, maybe. I mean, you shouldn't be, but the original peoples of the Philippines were these people that they call negritos, or diminutive Negroes, or diminutive blacks in the Philippines. But we're going to get to that when we talk about David Fagen. Now, so the press, and this is why it's important to have black press, because they gave a different perspective than what the Americans were given. And during this time, President McKinley was the president of the United States, and he was 100% for the U.S. taking over the Philippines. He supported it 100%, and he was 100% a white supremacist. So here is what the black press said. From the start, African Americans in the media and the leadership of civil society groups demonstrated strong opposition to the colonial intervention. The ambivalence toward the war in Cuba was replaced with vigorous opposition to the war in the Philippines. As part of the anti-imperialist League, founded on October 17th, 1899. That's when the war against the Filipino revolutionaries began. Du Bois condemned the war as an unjust imperialist aggression, the slaughter of the Filipinos, a needless horror. The League recalled Frederick Douglass's view, enunciated 60 years earlier, that the interests of the Negro people were identical with that of the struggling colonial peoples. We denied that the obligation of all citizens to support their government in times of grave national peril applies to the present situation. In November 17, 1899, the American Citizen, a black paper in Kansas City, Kansas, stated that imperialist expansion means extension of race hate and cruelty, barbarous lynchings, and gross injustice to dark people. Bishop Henry Turner of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the U.S. occupation of the Philippines, an unholy war of conquest. Another newspaper, Broad Axe, September 30, 1899, called for the formation of a national Negro anti-expansionist, anti-imperialist, antitrust, anti-lynching league. On July 17, 1899, a meeting of African Americans in Boston protested the unjustified invasion by American soldiers in the Philippine Islands. They resolved that while the rights of colored citizens in the South, sacredly guaranteed them by the amendment of the Constitution, are shamefully disregarded, and while the frequent lynching of Negroes who are denied a civilized trial are a reproach to Republican government, the duty of the President and country is to reform these crying domestic wrongs and not to attempt the civilization of alien peoples by powder and shot. Now, whether Fagen, that's a soldier that was sent to the Philippines who dissented and started to fight with the Filipinos against America, whether Fagen knew or was aware of this sentiment cannot be ascertained for now, but he certainly was aware that in general U.S. troops treated Filipinos as niggers who were therefore entitled to all the contempt and harsh treatment administered by white overlords to the most inferior races, as the correspondent of the Boston Herald wrote. So, David Fagen was one of the soldiers sent with the black regiment over to the Philippines. Now, according to the articles that I read, by the time he got to the Philippines, he was already fed up with the treatment that he was receiving in the military. Because all that racism and stuff that they had in the civilian land or in the regular land of the U.S. was in the military too. The military was segregated and black people were treated as niggers and second-class citizens and subhuman in the military as well. As a matter of fact, they were sent to the Philippines under racist reasons. They believed that black people were immune to the diseases, that black people were just better equipped to fight in the temperatures and in the jungles, and the black people were just stronger, not as long as they were under the eye of white leaders. So as soldiers fighting in the jungle and fighting in these harsh conditions, they were better built and better able to withstand just as long as they were under the direction of white commanders to tell them what they need to do. So they were sent there under these racist circumstances. And so David Fagen, when he got to the Philippines, he defected. And he did it like outright. He somehow communicated with the Philippines, and one day the Filipinos had a horse set up for him, and he jumped on the horse and went to join the Filipinos. Now, the Filipinos knew about the black struggles that people were having in the United States. And they wondered why these black people were the Filipinos trying to help the U.S. overtake their lands and colonize them. And they brought it up to the black soldiers. And I want to read some of what they said to the soldiers. And so I said, the Filipinos understood what was going on with the black man in the United States. They knew about the lynching. They knew about the treatment of subhumans. They knew about all of this. Just like I said in the autobiography of Langston Hughes, there was a Filipino here. So what was going on in the U.S. was known all over the world. Just like now, when President Duterte, not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but the president of the Philippines, when that journalist went up there to accuse him of committing crimes against his people, he said, what about in the United States where you got police just shooting down black people? He said, is that not appalling? You shoot black people, unarmed black people. So they know about that now, they knew about that back then. So the Filipinos tried to use that knowledge and they were informed. And they wondered why the black people were there supporting the white people. And it says right here, completely informed of the history of racial conflict in the U.S., the Filipino resistance used what one black soldier called affinity of complexion, revealed, for example, by a comment made by a Filipino lad. Why does the American Negro come to fight us when we are much a friend to him? Why don't you fight those people in America who burn Negroes that make a beast of you? The Philippine resistance came to speak as black brothers of African Americans distributing pamphlets addressed to the colored American soldier with the appeal, "It is without honor that you are spilling your costly blood. Your masters have thrown you into the most iniquitous fight with double purpose, to make you the instrument of their ambition, and also your hard work will soon make the extinction of your race. Your friends, the Filipinos, give you this good warning. You must consider your situation and your history, and take charge that the blood of Sam Jose and Sam Hose, he was a Georgian that was hung that year while this war was going on. And take charge that the blood of Sam Hose proclaims vengeance." So they were saying, why are you fighting against us for a country that doesn't respect you? They make a beast of you. They burn you, they lynch you, break all their promises. And it says, it is without honor that you are spilling your costly blood. The U.S. never honored African Americans or black Americans fighting in the war. So, David Fagen understood this, and he defected. Now, so while this war was going on, while these black Americans were in this war fighting for their country, this is what was going on in the United States during the same weeks. One might interpolate here that during the war years, an epidemic of anti-black violence swept through the South. Howard Zinn notes that between 1889 and 1903, that's the same years during this war, which was 1899. It says mostly 1899 to 1901, but between 1889 and 1903, so this war is in between it. On average, every week, 2 Negroes were lynched by mobs, hanged, burned, mutilated. In Lakeland, Florida, during that same period, black soldiers confronted a white crowd because they were refused serviced by a drugstore owner. Du Bois described the outbursts of racial violence such as the lynching of Sam Hose, or Sam Jose, in Noonan, Georgia in 1899. That was the same year that the black regiments were sent to the Philippines to fight. These and other incidents were known to the Filipino revolutionaries. Despite the Filipino appeal of racial solidarity against white oppressors and the offer of commissions to defectors, there were only 29 desertions among the 4 regiment of African-American regulars, and only 9 actually defected to the rebels. So actually 29 desertions among the 4 regiment of African-American deserters. So, David Fagen, the reason why he stands out among those who defected to the Philippines is because when he defected hard. Like, he rode out on a horse with the revolutionaries, and once he was with the revolutionaries, he went hard against the U.S. He made his presence known, and he rose up through the ranks because of his actions and because of his dedication to the revolutionaries against the U.S. He rose through the ranks, and he actually became a captain with the Filipinos. And I'm going to read you some of the stories that they said about him. Subsequent reports describe how Fagen wreaked havoc on the invading army, the U.S. with the invading army. One veteran recounts how Fagen, in the midst of raging battles, would taunt U.S. soldiers. During one encounter, he reportedly shouted, "Captain Fagen's done got you white boys now." But there was more to it than getting back at white supremacists. Instead of simply escaping to an isolated native community and withdrawing from conflict, Fagen embraced the revolution with such boldness and energy that no one could be blind to the depth of his commitment to the Filipino cause, especially in the light of George Roderick reminders that Afro-American slaves do not make revolution for light and transient reasons. From November 1899 to September 1900, we have no record of Fagen's activity as the leader of Filipino resistance. On September 6, 1900, General Jose Alejandro, commander of the Republic's army in Nueva Ecija, promoted Fagen from first lieutenant to captain on account of sufficient merits gained in campaigns. So, David Fagen defected and he fought against the U.S. intensely because he was against, white supremacy. They were in the Philippines trying to impose upon the Filipinos white supremacy. And on the next video, I'm going to talk about the post-colonialism and what it means to colonize, and that's where we're going to get into the miseducation of the Filipino and the miseducation of the Negro. But back to David Fagen, what is interesting is when I was reading the accounts of David Fagen, when the Filipinos started to lose the war against the U.S., because they were an army, then they were revolutionaries, and then they were insurrectos. They started doing guerrilla warfare. But the reason why we don't know anything about David Fagen and the U.S. wanted to erase him from history is because he wreaked havoc upon the American army in the Philippines, and he was never caught. Now, this brings me to another history of the Philippines. It said that once the captain of the Philippine army, General Emilio Aguinaldo, When he was captured by the Americans, actually by Funston, he was granted sovereignty, and he was a prisoner of war and all of that. But then he asked if if David Fagen, if he surrenders, can he be granted the same sovereignty that I'm granted? And then no, there was no way. The Americans said, no, if we find him, he's going to be court-martialed and executed. So David Fagen never surrendered. He never surrendered. He never turned himself in. And he was on the run. There was a bounty on his head for $600. And back in 1899, $600 was a lot of money back then. But this is where it gets interesting. So once the forces in the Filipinos were suppressed and David Fagen no longer had an army to command or be captain of, and he went in and he didn't surrender, but it says that he went into hiding and lived out the rest of his days with a black community in the mountains of the Philippines. And I was like, what, a black community? Where were these black communities from? Because I thought that when I was going to read into the history, I was going to think, okay, so, because later on, like they talk about thousands of blacks remained in the Philippines. I thought that there would be American blacks who established communities there and eventually mixed in, mingled with the people, which that did happen. However, there were original inhabitants of the Philippines who were black, and they were called, they called them negritos. And in this article that I have right here, they were called Aeta, A-E-T-A, which is a derogatory term, but they're called diminutive Africoids in the Philippines, known as the Agta people, A-G-T-A. So he stayed with them, and this is where it's also interesting because, so these were small African people. Now, when there was a bounty of $600 placed on David Fagen's head, there was a Filipino, Tagalog Filipino, who said that he had captured David Fagen. He brought back this head that was partially, it was decomposing. You really couldn't identify it, and they said it was a small head. But they said David Fagen had a small head, but it was a small head, and they had some of his articles of clothing, and he said, here, this is David Fagen. And then when they tried to identify it, they couldn't identify it. They never identified it as him. They never paid the guy his money. And then years after he was supposedly turned in this head, there was accounts of U.S. troops trying to capture David Fagen again, and they didn't. So he escaped. He escaped and lived out the rest of his life in black communities in the Philippines. And the U.S. does not want you to know about that history. And like I said before, 29 people defected, and they only kept the names of a few, and there were actually some white people who defected while in the Philippines as well. And of all the defectors caught, they killed 2 black officers. They executed 2 of them for public execution, showing the whole world this execution to try to tell other black people, you do not defect, or this is what's going to happen to you. Now, there are accounts of letters of American soldiers from 1899 to 1903, letters to home, and letters of them telling how they felt during the war in the Philippines, because the African American soldiers did not condone this war. But many of them fought this war because they thought that they would get loyalty in the U.S. And they keep doing that over and over again. And the U.S. continuously shows over and over and over again that they're not going to honor black people in the U.S. Because they continually, the honor is not just giving somebody a button. Because soldiers are supposed to be overseas fighting for our freedoms, but black people are still not given the same freedoms and equal treatment as white people in this country. And we see that in the Philippines. The Philippines talk about them killing women, children, and old people. And that's what's going on right now in the U.S. We could just look we don't even have to go back 2 years. We can go back 1 year and we can see where old men are getting killed, young men, children, and women with no repercussions in the United States. So what these black soldiers were fighting for here, they shouldn't have fought for. And the black media was against it. A lot of black social media that's out today that you can find on YouTube, they're against fighting in the military because we're not given the rights that everyone else is given. So what are we fighting for? And so the war didn't stop there. Because once you conquer people physically, it doesn't stop there. You got to get rid of that revolutionary spirit. So you got to erase their history, you got to replace their values, and replace the way that they think, and replace their history with the American discourse. And then that's when we'll get into post-colonialism and the miseducation of the Filipino, which I said was based on the miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. So the Filipino history and black history combined. So if they teach you black history, they got to teach you about these black regiments, that the Buffalo Soldiers fighting the Indians, creating enemies there where we shouldn't have Indians. The black regiments fighting in Cuba, creating enemies there where we shouldn't have enemies. And then over in the Philippines, black soldiers fighting again, creating enemies there where we shouldn't have enemies. So then we find ourselves today wishing that we had some type of help from these other minorities who are all living in the U.S. However, back in the day, we were in the army fighting for the U.S., creating enemies. And these people, some of them don't know their history exactly, but it's still it's passed down. So when I come back on the next video, we're going to talk about post-colonialism, the miseducation of the Filipino, and how it goes down. So this is Black Literature, Black History. Jason Williams. Have a nice evening. There's one more thing that I'd like to read at the end of this article that talks about the Filipinos of today. From solidarity to community. After more than 100 years of Americanization, however, the attitude of the natives would no longer be hospitable to Fagen or even to Haywood, Peary, and their kind. Filipinos have chosen to be on the other side of the veil, have exchanged their identity for that of their erstwhile colonizers. That is, they have chosen to be white in body and soul, a testimony to a century of McKinley's not-so-benevolent assimilation. The majority of Americanized Filipinos seems to confirm the fructifying power of what scholar David Joel Steinberg called the U.S. policy of self-liquidating colonialism, in which the little brown brother was permitted to achieve independence when he grew up, a maturation process that took 45 years. Nonetheless, Filipinos have celebrated some other personalities of foreign descent, including 2 Spaniards who served as generals of the Philippine Army, Generals Manuel Sitiar and Jose Torres Bugayon, and a Chinese General Jose Ignacio Paua, but Fagen has so far eluded such recognition. The reason is simple. The Philippine elite, vulnerable to blandishments, corruption, and patronage, has absorbed American exceptionalism and perpetuated the veil, fearing that to elevate Fagen to heroic stature would offend the fabled special relations with Washington and stir up the guardians of white supremacy. Maybe the presidency of Barack Obama will begin to change this century-old prejudice and finally give proper homage to David Fagen and his comrades who, even in the face of certain defeat, cast their lot with their brothers and sisters in the Philippine Revolution. So what this is basically saying is that the Filipinos of today need to be woke and understand what went on in their history, because they have taken on the identity of their oppressors, which is fully explained in this miseducation of the Filipino. And while I was searching through the internet and doing my research, I did find Filipino scholars such as this professor and other young Filipinos who know this history between the Filipinos and Black history and what went on in this war and what it means to be colonized and and they need to be woke, like we say in the Black community. So this is Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.